Well, I do hope it's not too odd that we're not in the month of July and I'm here more than just once for the year. But no, it is good to be with you, and I most certainly am hoping and praying for some rain. We can use it, and I know that we'll take all that we possibly can get. Let me first say, on behalf of Foster's Home, I want to say thank you for what you do for us. It would be a crime if I didn't take just a moment to acknowledge the partnership that Foster's Home has with the church here at Johnsville, and the fact that George and Lauren bring their kids here is a testament to you, and I'm grateful for the fact that they continue to be a presence for your church. It's a way in which they're able to give back in light of what you do for us. Of course, for the Leslie family and their presence here as well, and the history that their family has with Foster's and the namesake, what we do is so incredibly significant, powerful, and I'm grateful for them as well. Let me just kind of tell you, when I was here last time, we had a group of kids from Graham Street came and helped facilitate the worship service, and it was a pretty significant group of kids. It was 20 plus kids here, and there was one in particular that is incredibly special to me. He was confined to a powered wheelchair. Some of you were here, you might remember him. He lives in my neighborhood, lives right around the corner from us. His father and I are very good friends, and I think the world of the Gillies. And if you were here, you'll remember that I kind of got things going by saying that, I find myself speaking at so many different places, and every so often I get invited back to certain places. I think they must really be desperate. And when I get invited back, I really appreciate it. And there have been a number of churches that had, for whatever reason, had continued to invite me back. And there's only so much you can say about Foster's Home. There's only so many updates that you can give. And one in particular, I felt like I was running out of fresh material, and I started coming up with other stuff. And yet I wanted to make a connection with Foster's. And so what I was doing was looking at things that concern me for these kids that come through our program in light of the world's circumstances. And I thought, well, I'll start crafting messages that center around what I want them to know and what I try to speak into them when I have every opportunity to do. And so the lesson that I delivered that day was designed around Moses at the end of his life, and the sheer unfairness of a man who lived for 120 years, who had this immensely great epitaph spoken of him as he died, and yet he didn't get to go into the promised land, and how unfair it seemed. And I talked about how life is incredibly unfair, and one of the things that kids need to know is that life isn't fair, and that sometimes the consequences of our actions, or the consequences of things that may be totally out of our control, aren't always punishments. Maybe they're indicative of God's grace. And that was my perspective on the only real healthy rationale I could come up with in light of Moses' life, that God keeping Moses out of the promised land wasn't so much about punishment as it was maybe an act of grace, like, you've done well. It's time to pass it's time for somebody else to bear these frustrations. And the fact that Moses is in Faith's Hall of Fame and is spoken of the way that he is proves that him not being in the promised land definitely doesn't warrant the conclusion that he's not in heaven, and that we got to be careful about some of the parallels that we read in Scripture, like heaven is the promised land, and while it certainly is one that is found in Scripture, if you're not careful, if you take it to maybe too literally in a couple of senses, then you might leave a guy like Moses out, and that certainly is unfair. But I say all that to say, on their way home, Seth asked his dad, said, "Do you know that Doug was going to talk about that?" And he said, "No, I had no clue what he was going to speak on." And Seth said, "Dad, I really needed that. This is a young boy who's got a debilitating disease. It's gotten worse over the years, and it's going to get worse. And he struggles. He struggles mightily. And it's hard to be positive, and it's hard to not question and ask God, why have you allowed this to happen to me? Why me?" And the fact that it spoke to him the way that it did let me know that that sometimes we find ourselves in situations we would never expect, and we hear things that we never think we'd hear, and it can maybe speak life into us and maybe put some things into perspective. And the sheer fact that it did for a young man with a debilitating disease that's confined to a wheelchair, that I love dearly, just kind of lets me know that Sunday in July was a crazy good Sunday. So this morning, I'm going to take just a little bit of time, not much, but I'm going to take just a little bit of time because we do have some younger ones here. I'm going to take a little bit of time and share with you something else that I think is important. Maybe some of you haven't thought about this as well, but I want us to start in 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2. It's a passage most of us may very well be able to quote verbatim. We probably don't need to read it. And I'll introduce this by also saying that normally, if you read a commentary, if you read the biblical historians, most are very keen on the idea, given the themes of both 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, that John is most likely writing to address how a certain kind of philosophical mindset had crept into the early church. And it crept in from the outside. And this mindset had some very logical and reasonable components to it. And it was called Gnosticism. Now, there were some other things about Gnosticism that weren't very logical and weren't very reasonable. But the word Gnosticism was born out of this Greek idea of knowledge, gnosis, Gnostic, gnosis. There you hear the idea there. And these Gnostics contended that there was this certain kind of epiphany that could be had, that if you studied and if you meditated and if you did all of these certain things, that you could have this complete and accurate understanding of all things, all of this knowledge, and that it would bring a sense of enlightenment and maybe spiritual heightening that was unparalleled. And there's a lot of debate about where it originated, but it seemingly found its way into the church. And so he writes about this. Now, the foundation of Gnosticism was that deity could not inhabit the flesh. So Jesus was not really God. And of course, that was maybe the most detrimental notion to it, was that Jesus could not have been God. Because the flesh us, the flesh was worldly and sinful. Okay? And there was no way that deity, God, could inhabit the flesh. And so, while there may have been a Messiah, he wasn't really there. In fact, some have illustrated it was kind of like Jesus might have been a hologram of some sort. I know it makes it doesn't seem right, but it's the way some have framed it. You could see him as there, but it wasn't really there. Sounds odd, right? But it was based on this idea that the divine could never inhabit a human body. So when you read some of the things that John has to say in 1 John and 2 John especially, about Jesus, about him being, and even in his gospel account, you know, that he was God manifested in the flesh, that he's speaking to the perils of Gnosticism in the world. Well, in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, he says, do not love the world. And don't get wrapped up in the thing that the world is about the globe, okay? I know when we talk about, I'm traveling the world, right? What are you saying? We say you're maybe starting here, and you're going to go to Europe, and maybe you're going to go to the Middle East. And when we think about the world, we tend to think about the globe, and yet the globe really isn't what is in view when we read Scripture and when it references the world. It's about the age. It's about what's going on. It's about thoughts and the way things are in the world, most certainly, but not so much about the globe itself. So he says, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, now watch this, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. There's something immensely powerful in this triad that John connects with the age and the world in which we live in, being the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. It's a powerful triad, and yet, where do we see its origins? I don't know if you've ever thought much about where this triad of the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life originates, but there is an origination point. We can go all the way back to the book of Genesis, chapter 3. The writer tells it like this. The serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field that the Lord God had made. And he says to the woman, has God said you shouldn't eat from every tree in the garden? She responds, well, we can eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shouldn't eat of it, you shouldn't touch it, or you'll die. To which the serpent responds, you're not going to die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And then Moses writes this. And so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and a delight to the eyes and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit and ate it, and gave also to her husband with her, and he ate it. And time forever changed at that moment. it forever changed. It's what we refer to as the fall. When Adam and Eve both consumed a forbidden fruit, and their lives and our lives, consequently, were affected. And of course, they were banished from the garden. And they were banished from the garden not because of the dangers of the tree from that, or the fruit from that tree, but because in that garden was also the tree of life. But ponder for a second the tempter's temptations. You're not going to die. For God knows that in the day you eat of this fruit, you're going to be like Him, knowing good and evil. Now He's working a work. And He's got ulterior motives. And He's got a pretty good plan, doesn't He? But it's what Moses writes about Eve's perspective that should be screaming at you. Because Eve saw that the tree was good for food. It was a delight to the eyes. It was attractive. And it was a tree to be desired to make one wise. Now, that's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life of 1 John chapter 2, verse 16. She saw that the tree was good for something to eat. Can't be that bad. Good to eat. It's not going to kill me. It's pretty. It looks good too. You know, there are certain fruits that don't look so great on the outside, but when you eat them, you know. Anybody ever seen, every so often, HEB and Stephenville's got some, but ever seen a dragon fruit? Yeah, it doesn't look like anything you want to eat. It's pretty good. This fruit, it had everything about it that was attractive. And it wasn't, just by consuming it, it wasn't poisonous. It wasn't any of that. It wasn't going to kill her that way. And when she thought about what might be derived from it, pride swept in. And it was too much for her to bear. And of course, Adam was there the whole time. He didn't put up a fight at all. He just let her do it, and then you know, consumed it with her. And here's my point for the era that we're living in, for my greatest concern for kids right now, is the fact that biology seemingly doesn't matter anymore. You're able to choose what you want to be and who you want to be. And it's like biology doesn't matter. Facts don't matter. If you want to identify or associate with something as odd as a cat, it's being done. And the basis becomes, well, it just feels right. It feels this way. I feel better this way. And I get the allure of that. There are a lot of things in the world that just simply don't feel right. And sometimes those feelings are justified. They are. I mean, some people have sixth senses about things. Bless his heart, he is not my wife, and he is definitely not me. My wife and I are both extroverts. We don't know strangers. I've got a daughter who is an extrovert, doesn't know, but my son, my youngest, he is as introverted as they come. I mean, you can't hardly get him to talk to anybody. And he's having to figure out the hard way that he's going to have to kind of bust out of that just a little bit. But he puts up a mighty mean fight. As introverted as he is the greatest barometer of a person's character that I know of. And if my son has a not so great feeling about a person, he is generally right on. And I trust him more than I trust myself. Now, I think I'm a pretty good judge of character, but not as good as him. And sometimes people feel like they're a certain way, but they're not. They are wolves in sheep's clothing, and I give people the benefit of the doubt to a fault. Now, on one hand, that's healthy, because I can be wrong. Okay? I can be wrong, and sometimes I have bad feelings about people, and they're actually good. They have great intentions. But because I can be wrong, I need to recognize that I can be wrong. And my feelings are not always spot on. And sometimes I have to seek counsel from someone else. It may be an introverted son to get the right pulse on the person, because I can feel one way. And while it feels right to me, I may be completely and totally off. Feelings are not the basis for who we are. They're just not. And yet, the world that we live in, it's promoted, it is as pervasive as anything is right now. And the crazy thing is, 5 years ago, even though this was a thing, it seemed like it was fringe. It seemed like it was like ludicrous. And what was once ludicrous now is almost normal and accepted. Things can look good. They can sound good. It can make sense to a degree. But just because it may do those things doesn't make them right. Because even bad things can have an allure of rightness, of goodness, of wholesomeness, of something worthwhile. Back in the mid-early 2000s, there was a movie came out based off a book by John Krakauer called Into the Wild. Fascinating book. Read the book, loved the movie. You bear through the language. It offers a great perspective on life. The story was about a young man living in Georgia. His name was Christopher McCandless. Grew up, raised with normal family life. But had a little bit of a jaded relationship with his parents. Maybe they micromanaged just a little bit more than he would have liked, and expected him to do this and that and the other. Went to Emory, graduated, decided to sell just about everything that he had. Went off the grid. Didn't let his parents know anything about what he was doing. He roamed through California and roamed through the Badlands, created some friendships here and there along the way, and ultimately ventured up into Alaska. And his frustrations about life sent him on this quest into the wild. He didn't want to have to deal with human beings. He wanted to get into the wild. He wanted to get off of the grid. And so he did. He ventured up there and found an old abandoned school bus. And for, I can't even remember the time frame. It wasn't all that long, but for a period of time, he lived out of this old abandoned school bus. And he kept a journal while he was there. And while he was there, he started to realize just how much he needed people. And after spending this time there, he decided, I'm going to go back to my family. And he did. He started to walk out. And yet what he hadn't thought about was how come August, the snow melt from the mountains would create an issue for the river that he crossed to originally get there. And so he was forced to have to go back and stay there longer than he had planned. And he didn't have a whole lot of food to eat. In fact, he had bare minimum to eat, but he had a book. And that book was both poisonous and edible plants. And he was thumbing through the book trying to figure out what he could eat to survive. And there was a particular plant that was very, very similar in look to a very poisonous plant. And he went out, picked this plant, ate it, made him terribly, terribly sick. And he was already in not so great health because he had lost so much weight, but this poisonous plant that he consumed just exacerbated the problem, and he wound up dying, and ultimately was found by hunters. But of course, he had written a very in-depth journal about his time there, and it was a sad and tragic ending to a young man's life, all because he misidentified the plant. Seemed right, looked right, had the qualities of being right, but it killed him. And there are a lot of things in life that can do the very same thing, and yet they're not edible. There are thoughts, ideas, notions, practices, beliefs, convictions, all of which may have an allure to them of worthwhileness, but in the end can lead to our demise. This is the way things have always been. And I guess if there is one thing that we need to hasten to remember, is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The problems of society are no different than they were at the beginning of time. That what kids today are challenged with, and what we're today challenged with, all come down to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. It's the way it's always been. So be careful. Don't fall into the trap. Because things can look good, can seem appealing, can seem right, and be completely and totally wrong. The good thing is that Jesus died to help make all of that right. And he left us with direction. He left us with guidance. He left us with a spirit to help us. So that when we're confused, when we can't make sense of these things, he says, lean on me, look to me, trust in me. You'll get it wrong on your own, but I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. Remember who said that? Jesus. Remember who wrote that? John, the same guy who wrote this. Jesus is the way. Jesus is the truth. And Jesus is the life. And so we trust in Him. We trust in Him for our salvation. We trust in Him to make the things right in our lives when we cause them to go grossly wrong. But be careful. Be careful. And I hope and pray that there's something that I can do to help you make a good choice. We most certainly want to do that. Christine was saying.
Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you or evil a victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be free from your passion and pride? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Come for a cleansing to Calvary's side. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be whiter, much whiter than snow? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Sin stains are lost in its life-giving flow. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you do service for Jesus your King? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you live daily His praises to sing? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Be seated, please.